Behold! Well, now that that's done with, so Liliana has commissioned me to make a special birthday parlay, and their request was to talk about whatever I want. So here's what you're getting. I call this the Universal and Compelling Food and Drink for Buildcraft lecture by me, Zandy. Our topics for today will be sandwiches and cocktails. So basically, this is something you've run across if you've talked to me on Twitch a lot. I often go get food or a drink in the middle of the stream. It's been a little bit here on this second channel, not so much my main channel. It will be eventually, don't you worry. We have many things in store for this topic in the future. And basically, it's the idea of applying video game buildcraft to culinary arts, gastronomy, whatever you want to call it. And there's some foods that are better than others, or not better than others, but more interesting than others for that mindset. And here we're going to be talking about sandwiches and cocktails specifically. So, to give you an example, basically, I'm just going to give you examples and rant about this stupid topic because I love it, and compare the two. So, what are good about these things for build crafting food and drink, and what do I even mean by that? So, cocktails, for example, you can go buy a bottle of spirits or like beer or some tea or whatever, soda, and you drink it, and it's all well and good. Pretty much all of those things are like pretty good by themselves. But you can also modify it, and those things all have their own properties, and you can use those properties to make other drinks that are really, really good. And the best way to make something tasty is not to buy a bottle of Malibu and look at the back and say, oh, it says if I do 2 parts Coke and 1 part Malibu, it'll be good. Like, it'll be fine, but like you can do a lot better than that. And the way you can do better than that is by thinking about what qualities the drink or the food, we'll get to that, has, and synergizing with them. That's just how everything in the world works. It makes way more sense. You get a better marginal benefit if we want to get into that. If you have something sweet and you add something tart or sour, you add something bitter, you add something salty, stuff like that. And it's exactly the same with food. With sandwiches, I think sandwiches are, let's just not bury the lead, like a bit of a beginner's build crafting food. And the reason but that doesn't mean they're not good. And the reason they're so great, getting immediately ahead of myself, is that you can really clearly see the ingredients, and it's often a lot more intuitive with food than with drinks. I think that because few people make their own drinks, and I don't mean necessarily alcoholic drinks, just very few people craft a beverage with multiple ingredients themselves, whereas it's very uncommon for people to not have at least rudimentarily made themselves something that qualifies as food. No matter how bad a cook they are, like everyone's made a sandwich, you know what I mean? And a lot of people don't think of that as cooking, but you're still practicing the art of taking an ingredient and then putting things with it that synergize with it, right? So you take a sandwich and let's make a sandwich. I'll tell you a sandwich I had the other day. So Anna, my girlfriend Anna, wanted some chicken tenders, so I did some fresh cracked pepper on them, and I butterflied one of them so it was more thin, and I had it on 2 pieces of bread. Pieces of bread had mustard on them, some Dijon mustard. I minced up some dill pickles, and I had some cheddar cheese. So it was, and then what order you put them in matters as well. We'll get back to that later, but that's what I had. So it was bread, pretty unexciting bread, unfortunately. Anna likes white bread. I'm not the biggest fan, but that's what we had. And so it was mustard, that bread, some cheddar. It's pretty good aged cheddar. Pickles, dill pickles, and some cracked pepper, chicken tender like thing. Very good quality chicken, but still just the basic chicken tender. And it was really good. I mean, of course, it was really good. It was tangy. Now, in that particular sandwich build, if you will, what I was doing was focusing on a motif. The motif was kind of like tangy or not hot spicy, like zingy, zesty, if you will. And then I put ingredients with it that helped either balance it out or add dimension to that flavor. So it's not all about just like take all the different tastes and then put in an ingredient that is each of those things. You also sometimes want to elaborate on one of the themes. It's not necessary to make a good food to simply check all the boxes. Like you play with it. It's like making music too. Just like you might put the degrees of a scale into a chord, but then also embellish in some ways. That's not all you're going to put in the song, at least if it's a halfway interesting song. That it's the same way. You don't just hit the basics. You don't just put in all the stuff you like either. You do a mixture of both. And there are different drinks, going back to cocktails, that are examples of one or the other extreme or somewhere in between. For example, we have your basic sour recipe. I just think it's a basic cocktail, basically, which is usually basically 2 parts spirit. So, like, let's do rum, 1 part mixer, let's do lime juice, and 1 part sweetener. Simple syrup, but I think you should do something else. For a rum drink, maple syrup is pretty good. Agave is good in a lot of them. Date syrup is very good. And those are because of the unique properties of those sweeteners. Personally, not the biggest fan of honey syrup with my rum. It doesn't taste bad. I just think that the honey flavor is like an adjacent but different sweetness from the kind of like molassesy flavors that the rum has. And so it can be a little distracting. Like those flavors don't really deepen each other. They're just kind of sideways to each other. And so your palate just gets not overloaded, but there's that phenomenon where you can only really taste so much of something. And so if there's something else there, it's kind of like you just get half of both rather than all of both. The flavor has to be kind of different enough, like and not just sugar. It has to be like something else, And I find that honey doesn't work so well. Your mileage may vary. Right? So that's an example of a drink where you're basically just checking the boxes. You're saying we've got an astringent component, the alcohol, we've got a sweet component, the sweetener, and then we've got a sour component, or a tart component, the mixer, in this case lime juice. Even a simple drink, like a screwdriver, probably the simplest possible drink, one of the most common college alcoholic drinks, is just equal parts vodka and orange juice. And even there, the balance is still holding true, where the vodka is astringent. It's literally nothing else. The orange juice is about equal parts sweet and tart. And so you still have basically the same drink, right? Whereas a lot of other drinks will embellish much further. Let's now make a tiki drink. So we're going to make a rum tiki drink, a recipe that you can use as a starting point, rather than that 2 part spirit, 1 part mixer, 1 part sweet, is 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, 4 of weak. The sour will be lime juice. The sweet will be a syrup, usually. 2 of sweet is a lot. This is a place where a lighter, simple syrup I think is way too much here, personally. Let's use maple syrup. So we're going to use some, let's see. I have some ginger-infused maple syrup. Let's use that. So we've got 1 of sour, that's our lime juice. 2 of sweet, that's our ginger maple syrup. 3 of strong, that's alcohol. So usually a mix of rums is good. Again, that's because it will layer the flavors. You'll get a sort of depth of flavor there. If I could pick any 3 rums, if I could just teleport 3 rums into my possession and use them, I guess let's do 1 ounce of Lemon Heart 151, 1 ounce of Appleton Estate 4-year. Is that the one I usually drink? Anyway, and 1 ounce of, what's that one called? Oh, it's a black rum. It's not Kraken. I don't remember. Kraken we'll have to do. And we'll do a mix of those. So they're all different kinds of rum. Lemon Heart is an overproof, but otherwise relatively terrestrial rum. Appleton Estate is a funky Jamaican rum. And this other rum I'm thinking of is a black spiced rum, like Kraken, but I think it's a bit better. And they all have adjacent but different flavors in a way that will layer. They all have a sort of molasses thing going on. They all kind of smell aggressively like vanilla, but the Appleton Estate has that funk, sort of molasses funk going on, distinct Jamaican rum funk. The Lemon Heart 151 is proofy, pretty strong, but also very smooth. Really adds some astringency to what is going to be a high volume cocktail, because we're doing 1, 2, 3, and 4 ounces. And then we have the other rum, the name of which I cannot remember, which is spicy, as you would expect, and it also smells very aggressively of vanilla. It's not Kraken. This is some other black spice rum, the name of which is escaping me, but it is extremely aggressively vanilla, which will pair very well with the maple syrup. So again, we have our sweetener has some certain properties too. Now, why lime juice? Well, this drink is really sweet. Lime juice is, if you had lemon or lime or whatever citrus, lime juice is classic with rum, of course, but the reason is that lime is more bitter than lemon. Lime has some bitter notes, and even as it is a tart or sour ingredient, it has very little sugar, even less sugar than a lemon, and it's also significantly more bitter, and we are going to put some bitters in this drink, but we definitely want to balance all of this sweet. There's a huge amount of sweet in this drink now with something bitter, right? So we've got all that stuff. Now we need 4 of weak. What is the weak? So this is a little elusive. People get pretty creative with this component. Sometimes you'll see people do things like seltzer water. You can do better than that for a drink like this. Tea would not be remiss. I'm not going to put tea in this drink, but you could make a 1, 2, 3, 4 drink that had tea as the weak component. Not to say that tea is weak, but compared to these other components, it's a lot less dense, right? Whatever it's doing less of it per ounce than these ingredients are. In this case, we're going to use pineapple juice, which is a pretty classic one. Whole honkin' 4 ounces of pineapple juice. It might sound like a lot. Pineapple juice is also a little bit tart, especially if it's fresh pineapple juice, which is hard to get, but I actually did juice a pineapple yesterday, so I do have pineapple juice that is fresh. So that would be perfect. It's not too sweet compared to the other things in density, and it's got a little bit of tanginess, a little bit of sourness. Realistically, if I made this drink, honestly, I would probably do 2 ounces of lime juice and 3 ounces of pineapple instead of 1 and 4, but whatever. Then we're going to shake it up over ice and strain it probably up. These drinks do okay over ice cubes with a straw, but I don't mind this kind of drink served up. So anyway, I hope that makes sense as an example. That would be a tasty drink that I will probably make this afternoon, although I don't have 3 varieties of rum like I would like to. And that's just some examples. You could do whatever you want. It's common for people to use a sort of simple blend of just 3, they'll buy a brand and they just buy 3 different kinds of that brand and then they mix them. That's fine. The Blanco one, if you buy like a spiced rum or a dark rum and like a Blanco rum, I'm not sure the Blanco is doing a whole lot more. Like it's kind of like just lighter. It's not that it has a different flavor a lot of the time, but sometimes, anyway, blah, blah, blah. You get the point. So it's that. But you can see how for sandwiches, it's a lot easier to see those components. So we'll go back to my sandwich from before. You remember the tangy, zesty witch that I made before. So we have the mustard. It's Dijon mustard. That makes a difference. The pickles, they're dill pickles. That also matters. The chicken cutlet or tender, if you will. It's breaded and it has cracked black pepper on it. And the cheddar cheese is a pretty aged cheddar. So this is, again, much more simple, something most people have done, but it's pretty much the same as what we described before. It's not on some specific ratio, of course, but we all intuitively look at a sandwich and think, okay, well, but I know how much would be too much chicken, you know what I mean? This was like one little, imagine like a chicken tender, not little, but, a chicken tender, about the length of the bread, but not too big. And then I butterflied it, so I cut it, the way that it's hard to cut it, and laid the 2 pieces of it in there. So the main thing is chicken. So we have a savory ingredient as our main ingredient. This is not a very salty chicken tender. It's mostly very savory. Some black pepper on there, that will cut it pretty nicely. The breadcrumbs, like the breading on the chicken tender, is also probably the second most plain part of the sandwich, besides the bread, although I did use thin pieces of bread. I used the butts. That bread s, and so that part is also going to be pretty plain. But I mean, it's a sandwich. What are you going to do? But for this part, the point is that black pepper is probably the most individually striking ingredient because I'd put it on after the chicken tenders were done cooking, so it was a little bit raw, so it still has a lot of bite to it, and that's in the plainest part of the sandwich. So we've got the chicken tender. So this is a lot of savory flavor, but we don't really have anything to cut through that richness. Like, it's very savory and it's tasty chicken and everything. I like chicken tender as much as the next guy, but it doesn't really have any underlying flavor. There is room in that taste for something else. Savory things are great for this because they're just so round on the palate that you can add other flavors to them and it's not they're not going to get in each other's way. So pickles, this is traditional. When you have a burger, you often use pickles. The acidity will cut the richness of that savory meat, whatever it is, burger patty. That's pretty normal. And then mustard, so that might seem a little weird. So the mustard is there again as like the black pepper and the pickle and the mustard. I hope you can see how they're all sort of tangential to each other. It's kind of like the black pepper is here doing like a spicy, not hot thing, and then the mustard is in the middle doing something kind of similar, kind of spicy, not hot thing, but then it's also kind of zesty and a little acidic because it has some white wine in it. And then the pickles are doing that zesty, acidic thing and not so much of that spicy thing. But they do have garlic and dill. And so those flavors are all on a similar spectrum, but they're all like not quite doing the same thing. They're all very different flavors, but they're all in this similar category. And they're all pretty strong, so they can cut through. Like there's a lot of chicken in there that doesn't taste like much at the moment. It tastes like chicken, and so this will cut through that. Now we want the cheese. So why the cheese? Well, cheese is bitter. It's hard to think about sometimes, but if you eat a piece of cheese, we don't think of it as being bitter, but it is bitter. There's nothing else bitter in this sandwich, really. The mustard is, I guess, a little bit bitter, but there's really nothing else bitter in here. That also really helps you cut through there's so much zestiness, and it's not in the chicken, like it's on it. You're going to be eating it with the chicken, but it's not literally in there, and so having the chicken and then you got your zesty pickles and then pieces of cheese with the mustard means that all these zesty ingredients are not going to hit your palate at the same exact time. It's not like the chicken is coated in just cracked pepper, just pickles, and just Dijon mustard, because you'd bite into it and on the outside it would be like, oh, it's so zesty and acidic and too strong. But then on the inside it would be, it would be welcome that you had all that stuff in your mouth. But on the outside it wouldn't be pleasant. So you need to divide those ingredients up a little bit. The cheese's creaminess works well for that. Cheese is a classic palate ingredient. It's just very good at expressing the flavors of other ingredients in it. It's also fatty, so the ingredients are simply, like the flavors are fat soluble in it. Obviously, that's not going to happen very much in the duration of it being in your mouth, in your stomach. That does happen to some degree, but still, it creates this nice palate. Fats are always good for that. And then the bread, which is just holding it in this case. Generally, you'd want a bread that did something as well. Usually, I like a whole grain bread because it's savory. It does add that little extra bit. Sourdough is a nice tool, but personally, I already like so many zesty ingredients on my sandwich that I like sourdough, but I often don't get it. You get the idea. So what are the differences? So you get this idea of having, I'm talking like I'm a teacher in a lecture hall, sighing as though I'm not excited about this topic because I'm explaining it to you first year 101 students. But no, you get what I'm trying to say. Like it's food buildcraft. And so the important thing is to understand the differences of these mediums. So sandwiches, of course, everybody's done this. You can really see the different ingredients. What order you put them in there is really interesting, whereas it kind of isn't with cocktails a lot of the time. So for example, I was mentioning before how when you have your chicken cutlet and you're going to put all these zesty things on it, you don't necessarily want to put them all together. Some people might like that. Another thing that is related to that topic is the homogeneity in your food. So like how much do you want everything to be regular? How evenly is the mustard spread on the bread? How evenly are the pickles dispersed in the sandwich? How much is it just a layer of chicken or like a distinct chicken cutlet? So like each bite will have a different amount of chicken in it. Some people like this, some people don't. I think it's pretty tasty. There are a lot of people who will put like sauce in their rice or crack an egg in a dish, and they kind of don't want to evenly spread it around. Like they won't want to fully mix it together. And it's for this reason, because you kind of taste it more when there's that palate contrast, as it's not homogeneous inside of the food. This can be a problem in cooking as well. For example, when you have a chicken cutlet, a chicken breast, let's say, it's not even, like it's not all the same thickness. And so different parts of it will be done at different times. Usually it's not so bad that you like can't get it done or something, but this can be a challenge. Obviously, even just with burgers, it's like the center might be raw while the outside has the perfect crust that you want. So it's a difficulty. Whereas with cocktails, it's not so. You kind of have a somewhat parallel problem in dilution. When you're shaking up your ingredients, it mostly doesn't matter too much what order you put them in. Most of the time, sometimes it does. There are also advantages you can get for putting them in a different order. So, for example, it's traditional in the bartending industry to put the expensive ingredients in later in the process. Usually, you'll put your syrup in first, and then you use the other ingredients to wash out the jigger so all the syrup gets in. If you pour an ounce of honey syrup into a drink, like a good fourth of an ounce of the honey syrup is just in the thing you poured it into the drink with, right? And so you wash that out with the other ingredients. You just have to pour a bit fat with all the other ingredients. It's called a fat pour, just a little bit more than you would. And then the spirit, usually the most expensive ingredient, goes in last, just in case you mess up. And then the jigger's washed out. You perfectly incorporated that sweet ingredient that's usually pretty syrupy. And you also have comparatively less loss if you mess up making the drink because you didn't put the expensive ingredient in until the end. So if you mess up at the end, then you suck. But if it's any other time, it's no big deal, right? And then you shake it. And of course, it's important if you're making a cold drink that you don't dilute it too much or too little. You need water in there, at least most of the time. The vast majority of cocktails anyway, have water. And then you need to make sure you don't put too much water in it, but you need it to be cold. And different drinks will care different amounts about how cold they are and last for different amounts of time, maybe do better or worse with ice in them. Some drinks respond okay to differences in temperature, but not to too much dilution, or vice versa. They don't mind dilution, but they do very badly if the temperature changes. Generally, you would want to either put ice in the drink or not if that was happening. Callie, don't talk about cocktails behind my back. Callie's talking trash about my cocktails over there on the table. So what I'm talking about, for example, is we had our tiki drink before, our 1, 2, 3, 4 drink, and that drink had a lot of weak in it. It had that 4 ounces of pineapple juice. That's a lot of pineapple juice, but just as an example. So that drink is not going to change so much if you put a lot of ice in it when you serve it, because it's already got a lot of liquid volume that is not so strong. It's already a drink that is, all the flavors are very heavily balanced by something else. There's already a lot that isn't that component in the drink. So like for the sour, there's a lot in the drink that is not sour already. So diluting it a little more isn't going to change how much it's perceived as being sour very much. Whereas if you make a traditional sour cocktail, just the 2-1-1 cocktail, a fourth of the cocktail is literally lime juice. So if you put water in it, you're going to notice, like, it's going to be very different, right? Like, half of the cocktail is straight alcohol. So if you put water in it, like, it's going to taste different. Not in a bad way necessarily, but if you put too much in, And so you want it to be cold, but not over diluted. You can't shake it for too long or too short a period of time. So you might serve that 1, 2, 3, 4 drink on ice, whereas the sour you do often serve up. The drink is also they're usually pretty small, and so a lot of water can get in it pretty quickly. And the drink is also very temperature dependent though, so you need to drink it quickly, but you can because it's small, so there are trade-offs. Different kinds of sweeteners will also change flavor at different paces. So for example, agave syrup is pretty well known among people that use different kinds of syrups to make drinks. Agave syrup is mostly fructose, and fructose doesn't change in perceived sweetness depending on what temperature it is. So if you want a drink that will be sweet when it's really cold, usually a cold temperature makes something taste less sweet. So if you want something to taste pretty sweet, with not like a mountain of sweetener, at a cold temperature, this is classic in margaritas, you can use fructose or agave syrup, for example. If you don't want that, you could use something else. If you want something to have the balance from a lot of sweetness but not taste very sweet, you could use a different sweetener that would be dulled by cold. But then those drinks will change more violently once they start to get warm. It can even be a little disorienting with the agave syrup, though, where because the flavor of the sugar component in the drink doesn't change as it gets warmer, or, the perceived sweetness doesn't change, but the other ingredients, like drinking cold lime juice compared to, like, imagine drinking warm, like actively warm lime juice. That sounds gross, right? Yeah, like, because it is gross. And that would make the drink fall apart. And these drinks are weird in that you make them and they're delicious for like 30 seconds and then they just completely culinarily collapse after like 1 minute. And you drink it a few minutes later and nothing has changed about the drink chemically per se, it's just warmer, and now it tastes awful. Like some of them taste, it depends on the drink, but like daiquiris, for example, can taste truly horrible, even when they're still definitely cold, but just not like below freezing. They can taste surprisingly really awful, which is a shame because they're so tasty. So I hope that makes sense. There are all these different factors to consider, and that's kind of like the issue with homogeneity in your food. In a drink, obviously, the drink is usually not very heterogeneous because it's literally a fluid you shook together. Heterogeneous? Is that how? Heterogeneous? Anyway. But there are still elements like that. Like the drink will change over time. That's a lot. I mean, you can have a hot sandwich, but it's definitely less urgent that you eat the sandwich immediately while it's hot. Whereas there are drinks where the difference of 1 minute makes the drink garbage, which is definitely not usually the case in a sandwich. Sandwiches have more thermal mass most of the time, almost all of the time, than your drink. But there's another parallel issue too. Of course, you can have a drink with heterogeneous texture, like a layered shot, or there are layered drinks that are just not layered shots. It's pretty common to put a float of a high-proof rum on the top of a tiki drink, for example. A tiki drink just being a drink with a crap ton of ingredients, basically. And that is some heterogeneity. Something I really like doing is when I make a drink that I want to put bitters in, I float the bitters on the top instead. And so as the drink being served on ice, as the drink is drunk, usually with a straw, you're not really experiencing the bitters at first. But then as you get to the end, more of the ice is melted, so the drink is diluted a bit, but then a new flavor adds in because you have that float of bitters at the top. So the drink regains some, not potency as in alcoholic potency, but flavor concentration. Like it doesn't taste thin because there's this other flavor that gets incorporated in. Another experiment I was doing a couple of months ago that I kind of shelved for a little bit was making the ice cubes be made of something other than water, so that as the ice melts, the drink remains again like flavor dense. It doesn't taste thin because new ingredients are being like restocked into the drink. You could even make a drink, I was thinking, where if you can get the drink to be in portions that are equal to a number of ice cubes you could put in the drink, then you could possibly create a drink on ice that doesn't change literally at all over the course of it just sitting there, as long as the ice doesn't melt at drastically different speeds, which it will, depending on how you drink it and what kind of glass you use. But it won't if you stir it a lot. So an example of this would be, let's take our 1, 2, 3, 4 from before. Now we can't make rum ice cubes because it just won't freeze. But we could make ice cubes that have rum in them as long as it's not very much, like as long as it's diluted, right? So if we make that drink and then we set aside half of it, fully mixed together, and then you freeze it as ice cubes and use those in the drink, as long as the drink has a low enough proof that it will freeze. Like some drinks just won't freeze at all no matter what, but this one will probably, because only 3 of the 10 of the ounces of the drink in our 1, 2, 3, 4 are 40% alcohol, so they are pretty diluted. Like there's a lot of things that are not alcohol in there, and it's 40%, but it's cut across a lot of the drink, right? And then you could just put those things in the drink, and the drink will stay cold for a long time, so good drinking temperature. But as the ice cubes melt, they're just putting more of the exact same thing into the drink rather than diluting it. Now, this drink might, if it's being served on ice, it might need a little more water, but that's no big deal. You can just put more water in it. So that's an interesting idea. There's stuff like that. There's also the idea to put ice cubes that are something not in the drink. So like the drink doesn't have much citrus, but you put some lime ice cubes in the drink and then they melt and change the profile of the drink as it gets lower to the bottom. There's a sort of tradition in serving old fashions or just a spirit over ice, where as the ice melts toward the end of the drinker's time enjoying their spirit, the drink is more refreshing, lighter, more diluted, and that refreshes the drinker's palate for another, potentially. So it's very common to have those over ice for multiple reasons. It changes the flavor, but for multiple reasons. So yeah, there's a bunch of heterogeneity in both cultures to some degree. Sandwich culture and cocktail culture. where the different components you add and where they are or how they're positioned or what time they're being consumed at relative to when they were made will affect the product. And I hope it makes sense how it's interesting because making a good sandwich, like layering a good sandwich, is something that even people that are not very interested in cooking or care about the topic I'm discussing at all are at a surprisingly enthusiast level at. You'll see people who you don't really know them to cook anything in particular, but when they make a sandwich, they have this whole process. Like there's this, I'm definitely this kind of person, but I know lots of people like this. I might have gotten it from my dad, to be honest with you. He will tend to cook, some pasta with garlic sauce or, grill something. It's not like he doesn't cook, but he cooks simpler things most of the time. And yet when he has a sandwich, you get out the cutting board, you get like 3 different knives, you get all your ingredients out. It's got to have pickles and salami and cheese and like 3 kinds of cheese and, which like it totally does. I couldn't agree more, but it's just interesting how people are kind of enthusiast at that thing, whereas probably the simplest culinary art, making a halfway decent cocktail, is something that a lot of people consider to be this really inaccessible thing, even though they're pretty much the same. Like if anything, the cocktail is easier. Like the only hard part is the burden for the drinker, really. If you don't drink the cocktail at its optimal time, it can, depending on what it is, it can be kind of bad. But for you, the person making the drink, provided the drinker knows what they are drinking, like you don't really, it's not that bad most of the time. The only difficulty comes in when you are coming up with a drink. That is significantly harder than, making a sandwich. You could put most anything in a sandwich and it'll taste okay, whereas for cocktails. But that's more of a factor of, a lot of the ingredients you're using wouldn't taste good on their own, whereas in a cocktail, in a sandwich, it means we're basically at the end of the discussion because I can't keep him straight anymore. That was the first time I made that mistake, and it's been a half hour. I'm just saying. You have a situation where the ingredients, like in that sandwich I talked to you about before, all the ingredients are things that I would and do regularly eat by themselves, except for the mustard. So, okay, and the black pepper, but I've made black pepper tea before. It's not bad. You should try it sometime. Just brew black peppercorns like you would tea. But you get the point. Whereas in your cocktail, even in your sour cocktail, the spirit you might drink by itself, but the mixer, the citrus juice, and the sweetener would be disgusting on their own. I actually don't mind lime juice. And there are people who like just drinking maple syrup, for example. But you get what I mean. Like those things do not taste good if you have too much of them. And so you're at risk of the drink not tasting good if you just throw everything together. Whereas in a sandwich, it's like if you put twice as much chicken in the sandwich I described, it's like it's not going to taste bad. You're just eating chicken. Like I would have and did eat that chicken by itself anyway. So it's not a big deal. I hope that makes sense. And I hope that it encourages you to make drinks of your own. I encourage you to apply this philosophy to lots of things, to sandwiches without bread, for example, and consider how that does change the food. One thing notable about sandwiches, for example, is that the bread, while usually the least flavorful component, does serve an important role with sauces, where it makes them, sometimes a sauce that would be too concentrated normally is made bearable by the fact that the strongest flavored component, that sauce, is with the weakest flavored component, the bread. And so you can bear things that would be pretty strong to just be eating mustard. It's like pretty strong, you'd think, and yet it's kind of balanced out. You also have other things like all the mixology stuff with alcohol I mentioned totally applies to tea. Making a good iced tea is very much about balancing those things carefully. I was in Borough Market in London, the best place to eat random food in the entire world that I have experienced in my very limited life, except for all of the places that are better. Borough Market, where I had an iced tea. It was just a plain iced tea, and it was mind-blowingly good. And I pulled aside the vendor at the stall and said, "You must tell me. I need to know. I will never rest until I know why this is so good. Why is it so good?" And she said, "You have to put bergamot in it." And I was like, "Is this Earl Grey tea? You cold brewed Earl Grey tea, and that's it? That's really the secret?" And she showed me the tea she was using, and you put a little lemon in, and And I realized it's because that rounds out the flavor. It's because the bergamot has this sort of weird, like, yeah, bit. How do you describe the flavor of bergamot? Anyway, cold brew some Earl Grey tea and put a little squeeze of lemon in it. Experiment with how much. Some people might like quite a bit of lemon in there. Try unsweetened first and see how you like it. Anyway, Liliana, I hope this was a suitable birthday parlay, and I'll see you all next time.